Stats and Data Science department here. Started in fall 2016. One of our newest CAM field members. Before coming here, he did his PhD in Michigan and then postdoc at UC Berkeley and LBL. And today he's going to tell us how close our economy is to class.
Thanks, Austin, for the introduction. Thanks everyone for being here later in a Friday afternoon. So this talk is about a few projects which I started quite a while back during my graduate school, but then things evolved in very interesting directions, and I'm still thinking about certain issues. Overall, I think it's a fascinating problem. It's just a problem to think about, and there is ample scope for contribution from both computational, theoretical, and also methodological side. So this is a joint work with many people, in particular with Karpman, who is a graduate student here. The topic is measuring systemic risk with graphical models for time series data. So before I go into the main topic, I decided I'll have one slide about just telling you about what I do for research, generally, and how this particular project sort of fits into the general theme. So my methodological research broadly is about learning the dynamics in large systems from noisy and often high-dimensional data. Examples being understanding interactions between financial firms, how their correlated decision-making can have a bigger impact on the economy than their individual decision-making. Understanding how different macroeconomic indicators move with each other, how ups and downs in one affect others. Similar questions also pop up in my collaborations with biologists, in particular understanding about gene regulatory interactions from time course experiments, understanding functional networks of association different brain regions from simultaneous measurements on neurophysiological signals like fMRI, EEG, and G. So the stories are most of the time about understanding interactions in high-dimensional time series. So if you see different components of a system, like stock prices of different firms or fMRI signals from different parts of your brain, and you watch them move simultaneously, sometimes in a concerted manner from those data, can we gain some insight about how different components are interacting with each other, how they are connected towards each other? So that one major goal is to understand the dynamics and also, as a consequence, to forecast or predict what's going to happen in future. So that's the general flavor of the question. In terms of the machinery that I use, there are two different directions. One is building networks or graphical models among components of a large number of time series. So methodological statistical challenges essentially stem for the particular setup that we are working with temporally dependent data, and if you want to prove statistical guarantees, often you have to work harder and think more carefully, use different sorts of toolkits than majority of statistics where we work with cross-sectional data. And the second direction is tied more towards biological problems, but it's essentially reaching beyond networks to understand interaction among multiple components. So networks, in its essence, are talking about two nodes in a network and whether they're connected or not, how strongly they're connected. So it's essentially capturing a bivariate relationship. Many biological systems work by triggering off higher order interactions. So gene transcription happens within our body when different proteins or biomolecules sit on top of each other, form a big macromolecule, and then does something physical. And it's of very high interest to biologists to understand how different proteins, different transcription factors interact in a nonlinear way, and more importantly, 2, 3, 4, 5 of them interact together to lead to some emergent phenomena. So networks, while can be useful, are not the most effective machinery or abstraction to think about these problems. And we found decision trees or the ensemble of decision trees to be a useful formalism to start asking these questions, find patterns from data, which also turned out to be quite useful for our biologist collaborators' wet lab experiments. So today's talk will be about this part, a concrete question that comes up in economics. So before I go there, the main core, one of the core idea that I'll try to hit multiple times throughout the talk is this two way of modeling or thinking about networks, one pairwise and one system-wide. So very simply, if you think about, you have observations on prices of p different products and you store them in a p-dimensional random variable, p-dimensional random vector, x1, x2, xp. You can try to express how these prices co-move with each other in the form of a network. You will have p different nodes. And how would you draw a network or graph? How will you draw the edges? And there, I think there are two main lines of thinking that we use. One is a pairwise view, where I'll see if the prices of product I and prices of product J are correlated, and if that correlation is non-zero. In population or in your sample, if this correlation is larger than a certain threshold, you will draw an edge. The main point here, when you're calculating this summary, you don't pay any attention to all the other p minus 2 prices products. Okay? So it's a story fundamentally about two things together. It's a pairwise story. Then, what I'll call a system-wide way to build network would be an example, partial correlation network, where you just modify this definition in a way you're going to draw an edge between two products. If their correlation conditioning on the prices of all the other different things, that guy is non-zero. Okay? So if you have some indirect spurious association between two prices because they are both influenced by a third product, those kinds of associations will be washed away if you condition on everybody else. So it's a system-wide view, but I'm paying attention to what else is going on in the entire system. So how do people generally calculate these pairwise and system-wide measures? Pairwise correlation is simple. You just take two quantities at a time and look at their associations. For partial, one useful way to think about it is you regress the price of ith product on everybody except I and j, look at the residual. You regress the price of the jth product on everybody except product I and j, look at the residual. Then you go and find correlation between these residuals. So you take out the effects of everybody else and then see if they're still correlated. So it's a natural way to account for unobserved omitted variable bias, latent confounding, whatever you want to call it. Point is, it's a sharper, it should give you a sharper resolution of what's going on in your entire system. If you are working with Gaussian observation, there are clear one-on-one relationships. Pairwise correlation you can read off from a multivariate variance covariance matrix, and partial correlations you can read off from just the inverse of this matrix. So off-diagonal entries in the inverse of variance covariance matrix is negatives they correspond to partial covariance, and if you have non-zero partial correlation, you can just look for non-zeros in this matrix. So methodologically, in statistics community, Gaussian graphical model literature, there's been a lot of work on how to invert a covariance matrix with limited data when you have a high-dimensional matrix and so on. So this is the template picture. I guess it would be good to keep in mind, because all the stories I'm going to tell, I'll try to come up at pictures like this. So these are prices of different products. I have cotton here, sweater, trouser, hat, gown, shirt. These are not really data, just a schematic. A correlation network between the prices, a pairwise correlation network would look like this. Everybody is connected to everybody, just like a pairwise kind of thing. But if you can calculate a partial correlation network, you would expect cotton to be at the center, and everybody is connected through cotton. So when cotton's price went up and down, everybody else was affected. So in my stock price story, financial network building, I'd like to build networks like this, which does not look like a hairball, but can possibly entangle, disentangle, and identify some important crucial parts in the economy. Right? And how would you do that? What kind of methodology? That's the whole story. So before going there, the variance covariance, inverting the covariance matrix machinery to build partial or system-wide graph kind of falls apart when you think about time series instead of cross-sectional data. So this is a summary of what I just told you before, that you have 3 different products and you have IID observations probably. You can calculate covariance, partial covariance, inverse covariance. If you have fewer data, you can regularize, put some penalty. But essentially you are looking at contemporaneous or simultaneously measured association between 2 objects. Imagine you have time series like this. So time series A, B and C. B and C seems to move in sync. So if I calculate their correlation, I'll see a high correlation. But if I look at A and B, they are not moving in sync. But shortly after B went up, A went up. Shortly after B went down, A went down. So that's another type of relationship that does not come up when you think about cross-sectional observation. So time series gives us an opportunity to study this kind of rich structure, not just contemporaneous ups and downs, correlations, associations, but also these lead-lag relationships. So how do we build models to understand or capture lead-lag relationship? And more importantly, how do we build graphical models? So pure non-parametric way to define graphical model would be to generalize these notions for time series and say, if I have p different Gaussian time series, I'll draw an edge between 2 time series if their covariances are non-zero at some lead and lag. It could be time point t and t prime. If I see a lead-lag relationship or a correlation at some lag, I'm going to put an edge there. For system-wide, I can ask the question whether I see conditional correlation between some lead and lag by conditioning on all the observation of all the other time series together. So it's a much more complicated probabilistic question. So if I want to do a pairwise network, I could just calculate autocovariance. So I take this p-dimensional vector, find its correlation with the same vector but at a lag, and then study those matrices, what are non-zero entries in that off diagonal. That will give me some idea of what those networks would look like. If I want to do a system-wide version in a time domain, that's pretty hard. Like, without assuming a parametric model, it quickly becomes untrackable. Side note, and this is another line of work that I've been pursuing recently and found some success. You could think about conditional independence between time series, not in a time domain, but also in a spectral domain. And there you have lots of freedom to ask these questions in a principled manner. You could look at the spectral density, which is the Fourier transform of the autocovariance function. These are p by p matrices. And you can ask whether an off-diagonal entry in this p by p complex valued Hermitian matrix is 0 for all frequencies. Similarly, you can invert the spectral density matrix and ask whether an off-diagonal entry is 0 for all frequencies. Those will have exact correspondence to graphical models. So in other words, the questions that we cannot ask in time domain can be tractable in a frequency domain. So in financial problems, we won't have that data, but this I think is a largely unexplored area in high-dimensional stats where there are some pretty neat maths come up. So the fact that this happens has been known from early days, mid-90s, early 2000s. How you estimate this inverse spectral density and spectral density high dimension is the main research questions. So we have some work on the first part. The second part we are still working on. But okay, so we will talk today about this. We won't have as much data to estimate a complex value Hermitian function in the financial data. So we'll go with time domain and we'll use a parametric model, and in particular this notion of Granger causality. Anybody here heard about Granger causality? Can I say it? Sure. So Granger causality is a technical term for these lead-lag relationships. If I see one time series went up, a little bit later the other time series went up. If one went down, a little bit later the other went down. So I'll say this time series X is leading the time series Y. So what's happening to this guy is sort of as if it's shadowing or following the first time series. So it's this lead-lag relationship. Clyde Granger was an economist. He promoted his it as a tool to think about causality, so whether this time series is causing this other time series to move. And there are huge debate, and people largely debunked that this is causality for good reasons. But what I'm going to try to make a case here is the story is a little bit more nuanced. When Granger said you think about Granger causality or lead-lag relationship, this was his definition. So you want to see whether yt plus 1 belongs to a certain measurable set. That probability conditioning on the entire information set in the universe, all the way up to time t. This probability, you see if that changes when you take the time series x out of this conditioning set. So you condition on the entire universe's information, and then you condition on everybody except x, and then you see if that probability changes. If that changes, you'd say x probably has something to do with it, so I could say it's a reasonable way to think about causality. So the catch is, he said conditioning on the entire information set. And what people did, they sort of pretended entire information is just these two time series, and if you condition or if you regress one time series on the past of others, and you see a non-zero effect, people started claiming hey, uniform causality. And of course that has lots of flaws, because there to be a third time series affecting all of these, so whatever lead lag is happening is not probably due to this guys. But if you start from there and try to go from here to maybe what Granger originally proposed, what would be some middle ground? You'd like to expand your information set. You would like to condition on not just two time series, but a bunch of other different things. So that's what we are going to do. So we'll say we look for Granger causal relationship or lead-lag relationship between two time series after accounting for all the other components in a high dimensional time series. So if I'm looking at a 30, 40, 50 dimensional time series, and I have a way to reasonably account for these other 48 time series when I'm looking for this kind of lead-lag relationship, I could make a stronger case that maybe, hey, this relationship is something I can trust a little bit more. Okay. So, is what I'm trying to do clear so far? Something like an obvious thing to try. So the way we would try this is through a formal model, vector autoregression, where I model the multivariate vector of time series at time point t using a linear function of its own past. So if you are in signal processing, you probably have seen these things. These are classical ARMA systems, special part, vector value autoregression. What these coefficients in your autoregressive systems are transition matrices, and they are off diagonals, give you ideas about which time series are Granger causing others. For instance, if this quantity is non-zero, if there is an edge from time series 2 to time series 1, I'll see the 1/2th element of this matrix to be non-zero. So essentially, if I can fit a regression model to this, somehow estimate with reasonable confidence the entries of these matrices and fish for non-zero, it will give me Granger causal lead-lag relationships between two time series, conditioning on everybody else. So now I have a model, I can start thinking about fitting regression algorithms to it any way I want to. I can try to regularize this using penalty or Bayesian priors, anything that you feel comfortable with and have good theoretical guarantees for, but it sort of leads the way to understand or build networks between different time series. Yes?
So VAR generally requires data to be stationary. Is that assumption satisfied for the financial data that you're looking at? Because it would not have stationarity.
So it will not have stationarity, linearity, or Gaussianity. But looking at the data, I'll try to make a case that even if many of these modeling assumptions fall apart, the end results will still be useful in the context of the question we are asking. In a certain sense, the non-zero effects that we will see here, they won't be a big effect of non-stationarity. So we will first fit these models on very small chunks of time series. We will not use longer time periods just to make sure that we are in somewhat close to stationary domain. And so we'll be careful about that. And we'll see even when there are clear change points in the systems, the strong signals that we see, they don't move as much. They sort of stay stabilized. So those misspecifications in the context of our stories, I will try to make a case that they are not the first order issues. All right, so how these things fit into systemic risk and financial networks? So what is systemic risk? It's largely viewed as the case of widespread failure and severe distress in the financial system. And regulators after the 2007 to 9 financial crisis have started paying more attention to monitoring the buildup of systemic risk. So pre-crisis, I think the major emphasis of regulators were to understand whether a single bank is playing very riskily in the market, whether they are paying bad loans. But it was always a story about identifying one bank and seeing what he is doing. The idea or notion of seeing who are the other banks that are borrowing money from this particular bank, who are the banks who are holding similar assets as this bank, this joint view of looking at the entire system, that was not very prominent before crisis. But crisis happened, Lehman Brothers collapsed, and the regulators let Lehman Brothers collapse while they bailed out, I think, AIG and Fannie, Freddie, a bunch of other big firms, because they thought this would be a lesson to other big firms, because they are not going to play as much risky, because we are not going to be able to bail out every bank every time. But they didn't know that Lehman Brothers had tons of counterparty examples, counterparty transactions with other firms. So when Lehman defaulted, that shock sort of spread through the economy a bit, and other companies also took the hit. So the impact was much larger than they originally thought what it would be. And that, I think, shifted the focus to understanding, is there a way to see when one firm goes down, who else will go down with it? So this joint view, system-wide view, started becoming more prominent in the macroprudential, in the macroeconomics community since then. There is a name for it. They call it macroprudential policy making, so you have a bigger view of the joint system. So the question is, how do you learn about the networks of interactions? One way, which does not need any statistics, is to just go ask the bank, get data from them, saying who has given how much money to others, look at their balance sheet. It's incredibly hard to get. Often regulators have the access, researchers like us usually do not, and even for government, getting this data out is super hard. Companies won't want to give out this data. So that absence or difficulty of getting balance sheet data led to this flurry of research papers where people said, okay, if I look at publicly available information about all these firms, just in a data-driven way, can I get a sense of what these networks might look like? And also people realize balance sheet transaction is not the only source of risk propagation. There's a very big issue of common exposure to risky assets, which means, say I have a tons of investment in real estate, and Sid has investment in real estate, and we are two different companies, we don't exchange money or borrow or lend money with each other. But for some reason, say I am doing bad, not because of real estate, for whatever other reason I'm doing bad. My firm is taking a hit. It's quite natural for some of my investors to think maybe real estate has something to do with it, and just because of that fear, Sid stocks prices might also go down, because we are holding similar types of assets. So there is no physical connection or risk propagation channel, it just comes up from common exposure to risky assets and investors' fear. So there are different other ways that could contribute to the dynamics. So there is merit to understand it in a more data-driven point of view, not just looking at actual transactions between banks. So there are many papers that have been written in the last 10 years. There are many conferences, edited volumes. A lot of this actually involve understanding, analyzing time series of stock returns, volatilities, leverages of these firms together jointly. So Granger Causality identifies a predictive relationship, as we have seen. Standard way of doing regression to find Granger Causality relationship, it averages association over good, bad, and normal days of the market. So what's specific about the story is when we analyze this data, for precisely the reason that she pointed out before, we'll restrict ourselves to a very small number of time points, so we'll have maybe 30, 40 samples, but we'd like to build networks in the hundreds of firms, at least 50, 60 of firms per year. So it's a quite high dimensional problem, and we cannot expect the signals to be very, very high, because if you can easily predict another firm's return using one company's return, you will not publish research paper, you will invest that money in the market, right? so you can expect the signals to be not very strong, but the issue is you want to see what's going on here. In particular, if there is one firm or two firms who are emitting more effect to others compared to the rest of these forms. So this is the schematic. I have Bank of America's time series, Goldman Sachs time series, and if we see this lead lag relationship went down, Goldman Sachs went down, Bank of America went up, Goldman Sachs went up. In my graphical model, I'm going to draw a directed edge from Bank of America to Goldman Sachs. That's simple.
In reality, how many firms are considered critical or too big to fail or too important to fail?
Too big to fail probably would be, yeah, you go by market cap. So, okay, let me give you a quantitative answer. When things went down, went south in financial crisis, they give money to bail out, I think 60, 70 firms at least. The TARP money, the Troubled Asset Relief Program, they handed out millions and millions of dollars. So there is a big list publicly available for public, you can see. There are 60, 70 big firms that at least receive money. And then there are also firms they think could hit certain part of the sector locally, not the entire financial sector. You've got to be careful about those.
So the 60 or 70, these are all in the financial sector, like banks, or it includes?
Includes others as well. Include others as well. I'd say banks, and then I don't understand that part really well. There's some firms change their status to bank holding company for regulatory reasons or other. So you see insurance firms getting money. AIG was a big insurance firm. They got tons of money. So yeah, the role of insurance sector became very prominent during the crisis. People are mostly watching out for big banks, but then, as we'll see from the data as well, part of the problem with the subprime mortgage risk was the bad loans were being given out, and people made securities out of those loans and mortgages, whereas people who took the loan, they cannot pay the money, so that those securities don't really have any value. But people were still buying it because insurance companies came out to say, yeah, insured. These securities are insured. So the insurance companies played a crucial role in propagation of all these stories. It was not just banks giving out bad loans. So this is the very highly cited empirical paper that sort of started our research. It's by Andy Lowe, Monica Video, and their co-authors in MIT, came out in 2012. So what they showed is, if you look at Granger causal relationships between pairs of firms, this is a universe where you have 100 firms, 25 banks, 25 broker-dealer, 25 insurance, and 25, I think, hedge funds. You look at every pair at a time, see if there is a Granger causal relationship. You fit your model based on certain time window, some 3 years worth of monthly returns, so 36 time points. When economy is stable, these graphs are dense but not too dense. When economy is doing bad, like the left one is from 1994 to 1996, there is some connectivity. When it's from between 2006 to 8, this just becomes super dense. Everybody started becoming connected to each other. So there are tons of lead lag relationships. Here is a time series plotting the degree of this network as they did a rolling window analysis, 3 months at a time, 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 and just plotting this network at every time and just counting how many edges this has. So in and around, I think Russian default crisis, and here specifically when the financial crisis started, the connectivity of this network just went up. So in terms of the one main question that regulators ask, when you would expect a lot of risk is getting built in the system, these time series could be handy. Like you look at these time series trends and see when things are becoming more and more correlated. It will give you some idea whether to watch out for other things. One place where it does not do a great job, if you want to tease out a few forms which are very risky for the company, it's kind of hard to do that from here because everybody is connected to everybody. And there are strengths and you can rank them, but it's still, and I would like to make a case that this is happening because they are looking at a pairwise view. They're only doing Granger Causality 2 forms at a time. They're not conditioning on the other forms. They're not conditioning on the rest of the system. Many of these edges are associated with spurious. So when we will use our methods or the bar model, we'll see many of these edges go away and lots of effects still stay towards 1 or 2 important forms. So that will be the key takeaway message from here. Alright, so yeah.
Is it that the pairwise is able to track what is, like, just to keep the ease of tracking what effect is having what effect, in the sense like tracking which effects are traveling through that firm, or was there any other reason to consider only pairwise interactions?
It's just simple to fit.
It's just simple.
Simple to fit. If you are fitting a multivariate model with 75 forms with 36 data points, you cannot do this with least square regression. You have to penalize, regularize. And how do you do that? What's a good way to make sure you are not doing some overfitting? Those are interesting and important questions, which I think are being solved in the statistics community very recently. Even in 2012, those technologies were not like completely out there. So the tools that we will use are very recent. They came out in 2014, 2015 timeframes. So I'll drive home 2 points of improvement from a pairwise Granger Causality analysis. The first one is going from bivariate to multivariate, and the second one, which is predominantly Kara's work, is to change your loss function a little bit. Because when we look for associations, when form A goes down, form B also goes down. It's an interesting relationship. And when form A stock go up, form B stock go up, it's a different kind of relationship. If I have limited budget to learn association between forms, I will pay more attention to who are getting connected on the bad days. When one form goes down, who else goes down. If Bank of America stock went up, a little bit later AIG stock went up, I probably would not pay as much attention to that. I'm mostly interested in the market down. So if we change the loss function suitably, I might have a way to get better signal out of the system. So these will be the 2 technical points that we'll try to highlight for the tool. All right, so pairwise to system-wide. Instead of conditioning on one form or 2 forms, I'm going to condition on a bunch of forms and mean list to tail list. We'll model lower quantiles instead of the mean, okay, as a linear function of the past. And it will be a certain different variant of Granger causality, but we'll see that becomes more useful in the context of these types of questions. It will also lead to a series of interesting statistical algorithmic questions that we are still, I would say, solving. So the first one, network Granger causality. Here is the basic point. I have 3 time series, as I showed Bank of America and Goldman Sachs before. You see the lead lag pattern between these 2. But if you also have information about AIG, it might be a little more apparent that perhaps they are going ups and downs and has not much to do with each other, but because they are both influenced by what AIG stocks, how AIG stock was moving. So in a bivariate model, I will see 3 edges. In a multivariate, or as we call it, network Granger causality model, this edge from Goldman Sachs to the Bank of America will not be there. It will be deemed as spurious, and I will see fewer edges and a sparser network. So how would I do that? These 2 will probably be the only technical slides, but I have the papers on archive, so if you're interested, I can chat offline, or you can see it up there. So we'll fit a 1-order vector autoregressive model. To give you an idea of the scale, I'm talking about 75 forms, so these are 75 dimensional vectors. And I'm going to fit this model using 36 data points. So RT is a function of its past. Epsilon I'm assuming Gaussian with diagonal. So these are very simplistic assumptions to make sure I'm not introducing additional parameters. For robustness check, I did introduce additional parameters. I did not see a lot of effect here. Maybe my algorithm was underpowered because I had small sample size. But in this context, I draw an edge from form J to form I. This AIJ is not zero. And how do I measure AIJ? If I look at the return of ith form, I regress it on everybody else. And I'll do this using lasso. Can I see a raise of hand who here knows about lasso or heard about lasso? It's good. All right. So lasso is essentially a penalized version of the least square regression, where I penalize the coefficients using a sum of absolute loss penalty. And it encourages sparsity to some extent in your solution. So if the same data can be explained using three of these predictors instead of 7, it's going to pick the model which has 3 predictors, not the 7. So that's the desired property. Interestingly, just using lasso to estimate these things did not do good for us, because we found with a little bit of change in the data, the algorithm was all over the place, it was not very stable. So finding this tuning parameter using cross validation was a pain. 36 samples or lots of parameters to study. We were running into the instability issue of lasso all the time. We tried a bunch of different things. Eventually, what we were all satisfied with was the next big thing I would say in the statistics after lasso is this way to calculate p-values or confidence interval or do formal statistical inference with lasso. So this part has been in progress, I would say, starting 2013, 14, around that time. So what's the issue with lasso? When you add the penalty, your coefficients become biased. So you cannot talk about central limit theorem, you cannot talk about asymptotic normality. As a result, you cannot assign p-values or confidence interval of the regression coefficient. So that's a thing statisticians really don't like. So this trick was, I think, first proposed by Xunwei Jiang in Rutgers, and then there are 2 or 3 other groups picked it up and shed connection to how it relates to a lot of things we already know. So what I wrote it here is you can view it as a one step of a Newton-Raphson. So I start with lasso estimate, and if you think of lasso estimate as a minimizer of this least square loss function, for a moment forget about the penalty. If you look at the least square loss function's first derivative and second derivative, what I have in the second term is essentially inverse of the second derivative and something that resembles the first derivative. So it's like one step in the Newton-Raphson direction. In classical statistics, these are known as one-step method, Fisher scoring. So it's just building up this on the same idea of taking one Newton-Raphson direction from starting from lasso. So first off, what does it do? You can show that it reduces the bias of this lasso estimate to a level which is lower order than its variance. So you don't have to worry about bias, and then you can talk about asymptotic normality and you can calculate confidence intervals and p-values. From an empiricist perspective, what it really gives me is it makes my algorithm stable. So if I move my data a little bit, I do a random fluctuation, the results will not change much. The statistical inference guarantee stabilizes what I'm trying to do. What's the challenge in doing that? Why did nobody did it for so long time? Because it's such a simple idea. I am in a high dimensional regime, which means my sample covariance matrix is not invertible. So talking about the inverse of Hessian is not an easy thing to do. This matrix is not invertible correctly. So how do you find something that's a suitable estimator of the inverse covariance? And there are again different ways to construct this estimator. There are good statistical theory to understand the properties of this algorithm. The standard method was a node-wise regression estimator, which assumed that the Hessian or the inverse Hessian is sparse or approximately sparse, and use something like a graphical lasso, which is also a popular algorithm, to estimate this thing. Asymptotically, this M guy would be a good proxy of theta. So asymptotically, they have good guarantees, but in finite sample, at least in our case, they were not powerful enough to detect anything in our sample. There was a modified version proposed by 2 people from Stanford, Adil Javannath and Andrea Montanari, and I think it's a really clever idea. So what they said is, look, you want to find something like a pseudo-inverse of your Hessian, and you could do it in many different ways. You can try to find something that's close to the truth in L1 norm, L infinity norm, Frobenius norm. You can do a lot of things. But if you think about what you really want to do here, you want to build confidence interval. You want to get p-value for the individual coefficients of the lasso. So why not build an M that minimizes the expression of your confidence interval's length, subject to certain restriction on the bias. So whatever you need to keep the bias low, keep that here, and then minimize what would be in your final formula of confidence interval. It's a really clever observation. So once you do that, out of many possible inverse Hessians, you are picking one which is designed to be the most powerful possible in finite sample. So in our context, this algorithm started getting interesting patterns in our data, because we are 36 samples, 75 forms, so like 5,000 something parameter, even with enough amount of sparsity, it was tough. So this convex optimization procedure increases power in finite sample, and then where I was stuck for a long time, and I'm still not happy with one assumption in my theory work, is analyzing this method in a time series context becomes super hard. So just to see why that would be hard, if you had independent data, cross-sectional data, this expression x transpose, which is something like an error, a fixed x and Gaussian error gives you, a multiple of a Gaussian, which is also a Gaussian. Its distribution is easy to characterize. If I am working with time series, what classically we have done, we view this x transpose error guy as a martingale, sum of different martingale differences. The moment I add something that's a solution of a convex optimization problem that uses all the data here, the martingale structures get lost. So then you have to think about how to adjust for that and redo your analysis. So this was one of those cases where I found an algorithm that's heuristic. Really clear intuition, seems like it should work. It did work in my data, but proving it was really hard. So this is what we came up with finally. So I had to make an assumption on the overall level of sparsity of the inverse of the Hessian, the true population inverse, and certain stationarity or stability assumptions on the Gaussian Karpman process. If you are familiar with the bar model or time series in some sense, these are formulation of standard condition that also appear in classical low-dimensional time series literature. All I'm saying is this eigenvalue of the characteristic polynomials are going to be well behaved. The condition numbers are well behaved. If I look at the minimum maximum ratio of the diagonal of the innovation term, they are going to be well behaved. So under all these conditions, if I choose my tuning parameter correctly, or asymptotically of a certain order, I can show that eventually the typical result that I find for IID data, that should also work for my VR model. So working with VR model is hard in high dimension because the samples are dependent with each other, and you got to borrow tools from spectral theory, those frequencies, Fourier transform, and something with martingale concentration to get there. So
What's going to be third? It's
n and p,
both.
both p and n going to infinity. So np going to infinity,
Oh, I see.
and you need s, which is the total number of non-zero entries in your regression model, that to grow but much slowly than n, square root n. So there is no magic here in the sense if I am estimating s many parameters, I have to have s many samples. I cannot do much more than that. But finding those s guys out of this big p many time series, that penalty is of the order log. So under suitable sparsity assumption, that's the intuition of the high dimensional rates here. This max of k theta square, which is related to the sparsity, I'm not very happy with this assumption, but I can live with it for now. Maybe at some point I will be able to relax it. So as np goes to infinity, I'm still talking about one entry of the transition matrix at a time. So this is still a univariate object, but it's product of two different things which are growing in dimension. The inner product is still a scale. So for these guys, if I look at the ratio of debiased lasso and this error formula, I'm going to get asymptotic normality for 20. So I'm going to skip it. So either way, so this was our first method. We used this debiased lasso based bar method. On our data with 75 firms, banks, broker-dealer, insurance firms, we couldn't get money to buy hedge funds data. It was more expensive. We used debiased lasso bar. We calculated p-value. We did a 20% false discovery rate selection, which is lenient, but in such a low signal scenario, we still thought it's worth it. And we plotted the network's time series. The two types of plot I showed you. The degree of those networks at different time windows, you can see when there was some crisis, it did go up quite a bit. Sometimes it fails to capture things, sometimes it does. Sometimes it really captures the Russian effective default and captures, even though it's capture. Bear Stearns, it could not. But this was the most rewarding thing. So remember the Karpman picture, right? So here you have a hairball when analysis was done 2 time series at a time. When we did condition out on so many things, you see clear accumulation of edges around AIG, Goldman Sachs, and Bank of America. So it was much easier to explore and see where you could see the risk might come from. So that's a clear, good product of using these high dimensional methods in this empirical data. So this is the time series of the top highly connected firms on different rolling windows, and you will see AIG was like way off the chart. Its connectivity was way off the chart. Even 3 months before Lehman collapsed, Goldman Sachs started becoming important here. So we did this. We presented in a couple of very good econ conferences, and some of the questions they asked were, look, I get that you are getting AIG, Goldman Sachs, that's good, but what happened to Fannie Mae, Freddie Mae, BlackRock, Pearson, all these other firms? So our first reaction was, look, I have 36 data points, 75 firms is a really, really high dimensional problem, low signal. I cannot do much better than that. It is what I get. It's like a very sample start scenario. So increasing sample size was not preferable because time series are not stationary. We didn't think going back more than 3 years would give us something useful. But then we kept thinking, can we do better with the same sample size? And that's where the loss function idea came along, and Kara actually were able to flesh out and show that it's actually working. So strength of connectivity will be more important or prominent in bad days, so modeling lower tail instead of mean of return distribution can tease out weak signals with the same sample size. So that led to a quantile Granger causality. It's the same type of analysis, except we didn't have the debiasing inference machinery here. We were fitting a lasso type model, and we are selecting our tuning parameters by cross validation, but we have started seeing improvement. So again, the story in pictures. Bank of America went down, Goldman Sachs went down. But if you imagine, on good day, Bank of America and Goldman Sachs are probably playing their own game. You don't expect them to be very associated with each other. So I do expect to see informative pattern only in lower tails, not much in the upper tails. So these are patterns like this that least square based analysis will miss, but quantiles can pick up. And quantile regression is a well-known area in econometrics and statistics. What you do is you want to regress y on x instead of modeling the mean, you model the sum tau as quantile, in our case 5%, 1%. As a linear function, you devise a loss function which gets minimized at the quantile, and you can pose it a linear programming problem. You can solve using interior parameters. So we did this Granger causality analysis with quantiles instead of mean. We use lasso penalty to just stay as before. We don't have a good debiasing theory or inference theory for quantiles yet. We had done some elements of analysis, and in the interest of time, I'll not go into the details of that yet. It's still a work in progress. But let me show you the empirical result. You see, all those time series I showed you before, the spikes have become even more spiky here and there. So Russian default, there is a mini crash here. Some of them, I think, a little after things happened, like the dot-com bubble came up later. Stock market downturn, and these are things I think Kara knows better than me, and some of the history I'm not exactly clear about. We extended the data, but the basic point is we see sharper pattern, even though we are losing data because we are looking at tails. This is the bivariate quantile network, this is the multivariate quantile network with lasso. Here you see things are everywhere. Here you see a lots of blue edges is coming out of one form around here. That's AIG. So you see sharp patterns speaking out because of changing the loss function. We also found Freddie, Fannie Mac, Fannie Mae, and other firms at the top of the list in addition to AIG and at some point Goldman Sachs. So changing the loss function really gave us some signals. We were not completely satisfied with that, so Kara and I collaborated with one of our professors in Indian Statistical Institute. He's an economist, and he gave us data sets on Indian firms. And we tried, let's see what happens there. So it turns out we were not getting anything informative on the lower tail. But on the upper tail, suddenly we started seeing spikes of connectivity. And that matched up nicely with what happened in the Indian economy scene. So before the crisis happened, there are lots of positive movement in the market. There are lots of investing going on. People are playing similar strategies. So the connectivity went up before Lehman collapsed. Then things were pretty quiet for many years. Suddenly it started to spike up. This is the day our government changed and the Modi government came in power, and with lots of promise of financial improvement. And we see those things coming up at 80th percentile. So they are basically giving us pictures about positive news in the market. It's not distress, but some other interesting stories. So now we have more faith in the quantile-based methodologies. We went back and see which firms were highly connected, and not much surprise was Central Bank of India, which was highly connected to everybody. Indian Overseas Bank. A certain firm came up which we did not even heard of. It's called State Bank of Bikaner or Jaipur. But then we did literature search and found out it started becoming very important in the market a few months before it was acquired by a very big bank in India. So probably the algorithm is seeing something in the market that makes sense. And there are still a lot of spurious things going on. With the small sample size, I wouldn't trust everything. But conclusion, finding lead-led association in lower upper quantile is good. We are still working on developing uncertainty measure for the quantile story, just like we did for the least square, but it's incredibly more challenging. So that gives us good, interesting statistical things to think about, starting from my economic problem, which I really like. Let me thank my collaborators. Shreyushi Das is an economist who works at Pairwise LLC, and also my wife. George Mukherjee is my thesis advisor from Michigan, now is in Florida. Amritush Purnanandam was our finance collaborator. We worked on the first half of the project, the network part. On the quantile Granger Causality, Kara took the lead. Shomritho, a statistics PhD student, is now working with Kara on the theoretical part, and Diganta Mukherjee is the economist from IST Kolkata. Research supported by one branch from NSF and one from NIH. And these are the papers if you want to read more. Thank you. We have time for questions.
One question. So is there some sort of intrinsic lowering of dimensionality as you're sort of approaching these crises where everybody's sort of getting on to? I mean, that sort of seems to be implicit in that, but is that something you've tried to characterize explicitly?
Right, so it was actually known in the literature before it even went into this. So the first paper that we showed, the empirical finance paper, where they found the networks becoming dense during crisis period, they also did simple principal component analysis, and they found lots and lots of loading coming up on the first principal factor. So if you come up with some heuristic measure of how much relative loading is on the first factor, you can see that getting spiker. So people are being conservative, playing probably similar strategies. So that commonality was there. So BCA is another useful way to think about it. But what I think this Granger Causality network sort of gives you on the side is they can help you identify or tease out where like this differential connectivity or accumulation of edges around AIG or Goldman Sachs. These patterns are hard to tease out from a PCA story because you're averaging out on everybody. You can see who has high loading, but who else is affecting to that. These are both very useful, but have different connotations in terms of how to interpret the results.
So you had a relatively small sample size compared to the P, and that's presumably due to this comment about the stationarity. You are taking returns, right? That's what the data is?
So
I mean, if you extended the period, what happens?
the patterns start to get mixed up more, like this effective, let's see, this picture, as you can see, there is a little bit of monotonicity here. So if I do my rolling window analysis across different time points, AIG's movement is somewhat stable, it's not all over the place. If I fit this model on different data sets, the patterns start to become more unstable. So I see AIG being super connected here, a little bit less connected here, more connected here. So that gave us less confidence. As it is, I think 3 years is harsh. So not related to this project, I wanted to say what we are doing next. Kara and I are working with David Easley to sort of look into 2 extensions of this. First off, connectivity in monthly scale is very hard for economists to interpret. Like if I see something, I'm not gonna wait 1 month to play my game, right? So what these causally mean is hard to understand. So now we are looking into high frequency data on these stock prices and trying to look for Granger Causality type relationships there. And instead of linear models, we are using more non-parametric models like random forest decision tree ensembles to see if there is increase in predictability, and that's accumulating differentially across a few firms. So hopefully if there are signals on a smaller, finer time scale, there we have tons of data. Things are not stationary. It's a very interesting way to explore the next set of questions.
And one striking thing here is you are relying heavily on linearity. You've got the arch, the autoregression.
So these are fit on the arch residuals. So that's one thing we also made from the first empirical paper. So there is definitely like high probability we could see that from the time series. Once you fit Gauss models to individual time series and take the residuals, then you fit linear models on that. So you account for some level of heteroscedasticity. And I think you're right, patterns are going to be super nonlinear and everything. The question we asked is, even if you look at the first term of your Taylor series, does that have some information? The first term of a Taylor series would be the linear model, and turns out at least the signal on AIG or Goldman Sachs, those signals were pretty stable. Things were, they were probably impacting so much on the entire thing, it came out. But yeah, doing more nonlinearity has definitely helped. The quantile part is not explicitly doing nonlinearity. I'm modeling the fifth quantile using a linear function, or one, like fifth percentile, 1%. So we are allowing for nonlinearity, and we do see improvement there. So if there are ways to bring in additional nonlinearity without compromising sample size, I'm sure there will be.
Thanks, Victor.